How many of you went to school for a certain degree and decided you didn't like the job that you worked for? How many of you have dreamed about changing your career midstream? How many of you have thought about entering the world of real estate? We're going to talk to the one and only Mr. Jonathan Twadley, who has done all of that and more. Jonathan, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing great, Michael. Good to see you as always.
Yeah, so let's remind folks, right? If they've been around a while on the channel, they know your story, but the channel is two, three, four times bigger since I think we've went through this. What did Jonathan Twombly go to school to be?
Well, I guess it depends on how far back you want to go with that
Okay,
question. But I mean, actually, originally I thought I was going to be a college professor. So I studied American history.
I could see that.
And um, sometimes I think maybe I should have done that, but for lifestyle reasons, But those summers off were off
Yeah.
with, my dad was a professor and my mom was a school teacher. So I thought, nobody worked in the summertime. That was my experience, right?
That was your mom and dad are home all the time in the summer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Like we just go and do what we want for the whole summer. It's awesome, So
Yeah.
uh, you know, there's a certain appeal to that lifestyle. But anyway,
Okay.
yeah. But then at some point along the line, I decided that I would go to law school, and
Hmm.
uh, mostly because I thought I wanted to make more money than I would make as a college professor, and
Okay.
um, so I went to law school and then did practice law for altogether about 12 years. Um,
Wow.
but not really happy after about year three, right? So the
Yeah.
first few years I actually really enjoyed, which is unusual, but it kind of all caught up to me after about year three, and just got really unhappy.
Yeah, there's a lot of folks. I hear this. I don't know what it is about being an attorney. It's like attorneys and dentists. I hear
Yeah.
from a lot that, they go to school. Many of them take on huge amounts of debt, and then they get into the career. And at some early point, some of them year one, your case year three, some year five, they're like, I hate this, but they're trapped,
Yeah.
right? They've got six figures in student debt, and they're just unhappy every day.
Yeah. I don't know what it is about dentists, but with lawyers, it's funny. I was reading something the other day. I mean, I read a lot of business books and I read a lot of books. I like also books about like positive psychology and
Mhm.
peak performance, and so I don't remember where I read this because I read so much, but I came across this that someone was writing about sort of what makes for a rewarding job, right? Like what jobs, like the as a really general matter, like what makes a job rewarding, and like what makes a job rewarding is the the ability to feel like you're growing, but also the ability to like feel like your work means something, and the
Yeah,
and
it
the way you feel like your
matters.
work means something is that you get feedback, right? So it's
Mhm.
not like, oh, it matters in the sense like I'm helping people or like do-gooderism, but it matters in the sense that you feel like you're actually accomplishing something.
Mhm.
And so when you have jobs where the work and the result are really far apart from each other, it's a recipe for being miserable. And that's really what law is like, at least on the litigation side, because you'd spend 2, 3 years like working on a case and working a lot, like working around the clock and under all kinds of deadlines, most of which are artificial, some of which are court imposed, but they're deadlines nonetheless. It's always like hurry up, hurry up, hurry up all the time. And then you finally you submit your motion, you submit your motion for summary judgment, or you go to trial, and then what happens? The decision comes out like a year or two later, right?
Wow.
So, so like even on a regular motion, the decision could be like weeks later when you get it, right? So
Mm.
it's like you don't get feedback for a long, long time. And then by the time the feedback comes, you've moved on mentally. And there's also this kind of culture in law where um, it's like really tough. And and sort of like the culture, at least when I was there, the culture was like, look, like, oh, you want some praise, you want some
Mm.
recognition, like, you know,
Mhm.
get over yourself, right? It's a hard
Sounds like
job.
a sales job.
Yeah, it's like you get paid a lot of money, so just suck it
Shut
up,
up and take it. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah,
and
yeah.
it's like, and it's kind of like, well, yeah, you do make a lot of money, but it's just most people are really unhappy. Like
Mm,
somewhere up to like 90% of lawyers hate their jobs because of that combination of like intense pressure and then never feeling like it really means anything and never getting any feedback and
okay.
never and sort of being in the dark about like whether you're really growing, you're improving,
Mm,
and then there's also all the politics BS. It always seems like it's all, it's never like the people who get promoted always seem to be the people who are like really good at politics and
mm.
not necessarily good at law.
Got it. Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah,
So you practiced it for 12 years or
yeah,
yeah, for 12 years. You were unhappy after, let's call it year 3.
yeah,
That's 9 years of unhappiness. When
yeah.
did it dawn on you that, quitting was possible? And not only quitting, but what the heck would you do? Because
Well, so
yeah, lawyers make a lot of money.
I figured out the quitting part really early, right?
Okay.
I just couldn't figure out what to do next. So
Mm,
I I walked off the job several times, like with no plan, because I was
mm,
just so, and I guess the good thing was that I made enough money that I would have money in the bank. But
okay.
a couple of times, like I walked off the job because I just couldn't take it anymore, but I
Mm,
didn't have a plan. And I just sort of like, I spent the next, 3 to 6 months just decompressing,
mm.
but then I would be like, oh, oh my God, I don't have any money left. I got to go get a
I gotta
job.
go back. Yeah.
I don't know what else to do. And it was just easy just to go back into, because I could get a job instantly, right,
Okay.
in law. And so I never, so I did that. I did that a couple of times
Mm,
because I just
okay.
really couldn't figure out what I wanted to do.
Mm,
And so I mean, that's on me. Like I tried. I mean, I don't know. I really did try to figure it out, but I just really couldn't figure it out. So I went back to law and then I thought I had it figured out. I quit. I was like, the second time I quit, I was like, okay, I need a plan this time.
yeah.
So,
That first
so
time didn't work so well. Let's
yeah, the
try
first
having a
time didn't work
plan.
so well. So this time I need a plan. So I decided I was going to go back to plan A, which is to become a college professor. Right.
Oh, okay. All right.
So I went and got myself into PhD program to study Japanese history this time. I thought I would maybe that would be more exciting
Change
to
it up.
me,
Yeah.
change it up. I mean, I had lived in Japan and all that kind of stuff. And so um, got into a good PhD program and did that for a couple of years, but I kind of realized like this isn't really the answer. Like I didn't really like it as much as I thought I was going to like
Mm.
it. And I just didn't. I looked around me at like my colleagues and they were all really passionate about it. And I was like, man, I'm just here to run away from being a lawyer. Like I'm
Yeah.
not
Yeah, there's no passion here. I'm just running away, not running to. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. This turned out not to be what I wanted. And then I met my wife and I was like, okay, I don't really think that just the way that the job market works in academia, like my first job was probably going to be at some college like in the middle of nowhere, right?
Right.
And I was like, I don't really think I want to subject my wife to being like the only Japanese person within 100 miles, you
Right.
know. So
That's
I
rough.
so I decided, okay, well, I'll go back into law again and figure out what to do.
Mhm.
And then the Great Recession hit. So I was like, okay, glad to have a job. And I
Right.
was like busy through the Great Recession. But then after the Great Recession, the work just really dried up at my
Mm.
firm. And so I had a couple of years of sort of sitting around making a lot of money without really much to do. And finally that caught up with me and my firm decided to let me go, which, you would, I was surprised it took them so long.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
you know,
That's a big
but
line item right there. Yeah.
yeah, I know. Seriously, I guess. Well, they kept on. I guess the way it is, like they knew I was good. They knew I would be
Mhm.
hard to replace, and they were always hoping that the work was going to come back.
Right.
But they didn't really have anybody in litigation who was a good rainmaker. That was really the
Right.
problem. So I guess they
Yeah.
finally figured out that like it wasn't the rain wasn't going to just magically fall on them, right,
Mhm.
without a real rainmaker there, and so they let me go. And at that point, I was like, I really have to figure out like
So what
the
year
real
was that
plan.
roughly in the
So this
story
is
here?
2011.
Okay. Oh,
So
2011. That's okay. I got you. So
yeah,
you did get through the recession. We know in hindsight that that was kind of the start of the slow uptick in real
yeah.
estate.
Of
Okay.
course, at the time it felt bad, right?
It
But
did feel bad. Yep.
yeah,
Mhm.
but it was still, yeah, it was the recession itself, was over. We were back into a growth phase, but people were
Mhm.
still feeling the pain.
Yeah. We didn't know it
And
yet. Yep.
yeah,
Mhm.
so what happened at that point was I had decided at that point that I really wanted to go into real estate.
Okay.
And um,
But how? When did that? What was it? I mean, was it something you read, somebody you talked to,
well,
somebody in your network?
I'd
What was it?
always been interested in it. Like as a
Okay.
kid, I remember like my one of my favorite activities as a kid was like I remember like when newspapers had real estate sections,
Oh
maybe they
yeah.
still do. But like as
They
a
probably.
kid, like the New York Times had this like massive real estate section, and it was all like these, it was almost all like these super
Yeah.
houses that like really
Luxury
wealthy
homes.
people, yeah, would.
Yep.
And so I would like look through those and be like, oh wow, I wish I could live in this house, wish I could live in that
Yeah.
house.
Me too. I've
And
done
it,
that.
and I never thought like that, I never thought like, oh, you can make money off real estate. It was more like, oh, these houses are so cool. Then as
Mm.
I got older, I was, started reading stuff. I did, I read the stuff everybody else reads, like Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and all this kind of stuff. And I started thinking like, oh, I could make money off this
Mm.
somehow. But so during those 2 years when I was sitting around like at my desk waiting for somebody to give me work, I actually spent a lot of that time on like Trulia and Zillow and stuff,
Mm.
just looking at like duplexes in upstate New York. Cause I was like, I can't afford anything in New York, but I, so where could I buy something that I could afford?
Mhm.
But then I kind of ran into this issue where I was like, well, I just don't think I can replace my salary fast enough by
Right.
buying these small houses, right? I mean, if I'm
Yeah.
going to be
Yeah.
making,
$400 a month or
yeah,
300,
exactly.
whatever it is. You know,
Yeah,
I
there
gotta have
was,
like 100 units or whatever. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. I did exactly that calculation. I was like, man, I'm going to have to buy like 100 of these. And I could buy maybe one a year,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. That's a big gap.
Yeah, exactly, right? So, like, how on earth am I gonna do I probably could have done it faster if I really understood how it worked, but at the time, I was like, "Okay, I
Yeah.
have to have a big down payment, and I have to
Yeah.
whatever," and, so, um, never thought about partnering with people, didn't know anything about syndication. So, what then happened was I got laid off from my job 2011,
Mhm.
and I
Yep.
remember, like, talking with my colleagues, and they were like, it was, like, in January, and they're like, you know, people start talking about bonuses, and I'm like, wait a minute, I didn't get a bonus. What?
Mm.
Why didn't I get a bonus? That's really weird,
Mm.
And then like I found out it's because they were going to terminate me. So they gave me a long severance period, which was great. I mean, it was pretty generous severance. So I had several months to kind of like figure out what I was going to do, and I realized I just had just zero interest in trying to find another law job. I used to
Okay.
describe it as like, how on earth am I going to interview for a job that I don't want?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. You think that comes across in an interview? Yeah, probably.
Yeah, exactly. Like, how am I going to do this job I
Yeah.
don't want? Right. So, um, I, I, uh, so I started doing all this networking, and I started talking to people who were in real estate. And I guess my first thought in those days was like, because I was used to working in a big firm, I thought, okay, I'm going to go work for like a private equity firm, like
Makes
private
sense.
equity, hedge fund,
Yeah.
something.
Yeah.
So I started talking to a lot of people and basically was getting this feedback that was like, you have a great resume, like you're obviously a talented guy, but like no one's going to hire you for one of these jobs because right now there's like 10,000 people out in the street who've been doing this for 20 years and they're
Mhm.
looking for jobs, and like they're not going to hire you to do this, especially it's
Yeah.
some kind of like you're too senior for an entry level job, right? So someone said to me, you're only going to break into this business if somebody just takes a liking to you and offers to partner up with you.
Right.
And so lo and behold, as I'm doing all this networking, I meet somebody who she said, oh, I'm in commercial real estate. So I was like, oh, I want to talk to this person. So I start talking to her. We met for coffee, and then she explained what she was doing. And she was like, how'd you like to be my partner? And I was like, okay, I don't know. I don't know if I want to be your partner. I don't even know how to like approach this situation. So what I did was I went and I said, okay, I'm gonna introduce you to some of my like wealthy friends. Mostly because I wanted them to give me feedback on her.
Uh,
I was
got
like,
it. Makes
I was
sense.
like, You guys are sophisticated investors.
Mhm.
You know, you listen to what she says, and then you tell me whether you think this is a good idea or not. And
Okay.
so so what happened then was both of these people said the same thing to me, which was, you know, I don't know if you're going to like whatever you decide to do is fine. But if you decide to partner up with her, I will give you $1 million to invest. So I had $2 million like raised before I
Mm.
even tried to raise any money.
Mm.
And then, and like from people who I knew were going to give it to me, like it wasn't like somebody just saying
Yeah.
it. Like I knew that
It
these
was a
guys would
promise.
come through if I asked them. Right.
Yep. Yep.
And um, so I was like, okay, well, maybe I ought to do this because somebody just told me the only way I was going to break into this business is if somebody offered to be my partner. Somebody just
Right.
offered to be my partner. And then these two people offered to invest with me. So maybe I should try this out.
Okay.
So I said yes. And then the funny thing was, I really didn't know what we were going to do. And she hadn't really explained like syndication and stuff to me yet.
Mhm.
I just sort of had this assumption because I was living here in New York City, and all that people talk about here was like buying brownstones and gentrifying neighborhoods and like getting the appreciation, right? There
Right.
wasn't any discussion about cash flow, about like anything. It was just
Yeah.
all about like essentially taking a bet, right?
Yeah.
Like this is the next block to get gentrified, you know? So,
Mhm.
and you know, I know this guy who bought this brownstone 20 years ago for $100,000. Now it's worth 2 million. Right? That was kind of like that was all people talked about. So I
Right.
sort of thought, well, that's what we're going to do. And but no, like on our first sort of day at work, where I went to, like we were working out of her dining room, and I remember going to her house, and she was like, "Oh no, 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 we're not going to buy brownstones. We're going to buy these 100 unit properties in Louisiana." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And
Mhm.
I was like, how do you do that? How do you buy 100 units? Like that must be like so much money. And it turned out, at least in those days, you know, 100 units in Louisiana
Not
cost the same
much.
as a brownstone in Brooklyn, right?
Exactly.
So we started pursuing deals like that. And that's basically how I don't know if you expected me to go on this long with this
Yeah.
answer, but like this
No,
is
I
how I
like
got
it.
my start. Yeah.
Yeah. So if I were to summarize it, because there's a lot of people that hate their job. You know, you jumped in, jumped out a couple of times. The Great Recession, you were working through that, got laid off, and you had to find something. So I love that story. Let's kind of jump forward. What I think most people understand what a day in the life is. For a lawyer, or if you don't like the job, a dentist, whatever. But let's paint the vision of the other side. You've been out of the game. I'm not practicing for over a decade now, if my math's
Yeah.
right.
I'm going on 13. My next month will be my 13th anniversary. Not March. March will be.
So why don't you kind of paint a vision now? You're an active syndicator. You have deals that are done that you're operating. You have a raise going on, I think, in Sioux Falls, if I remember
Yeah.
right from
Yeah.
from last week. What does an average day, or maybe better said, a week look like for you today? Now versus maybe what it was, 15 years ago.
Well, I mean, listen, the biggest change is that I have complete control over my time, right?
Mm,
So I I have an office, you know, I don't work from home because I do need someplace to go, but I come here when I want to.
mhm,
So the flip side is that I have to discipline myself, right? I don't have anybody telling me what to do. And I did struggle with that for a long time of like nobody's telling me what to do. So I kind of like goof off, like it wouldn't really, work that much. And like staying focused was really hard. And I had days where I'd be like on looking at my phone the entire day, right? Because I
mm,
couldn't really figure out what should I be doing with myself.
mhm,
Um, but my my days now are, you know, I I get up at, you know, before 5.
mm,
I I do like my morning routine, and then everybody gets up and I help the kids get ready for school and get them out of the house. And I try to be in my office by about 8:30, right?
okay.
And so I'm here a full
Is it walking distance? I'm just
no, but I do walk. I mean, it's a subway ride, but I get off 3 stops early to make sure I get my steps in. So
Oh,
I
good for you. Okay.
so I walk I walk a lot. And then, you know, my day is kind of comprised, it's sort of every day is different,
Mhm,
but I've got I'm usually I try to send out an email to my list most days. I mean, sometimes I do, sometimes I don't, but that's something that I strive to do. I do a certain amount of social media just because, it really helps to kind of get the name out there, and it does build the list. I'm doing my podcast. I'm on your show. So I'm doing a fair amount of sort of marketing related activities
Mhm.
just to continue to build my my list, right? And
Okay.
which is
Yeah.
kind of, I think, that's one thing I didn't get early on when I started. I sort of had this idea that like if I just did a good job, then like investors would somehow find me, and didn't realize like how critical marketing is. So I spend
Yeah.
time in marketing, and actually plan for 2024 is I'm going to be spending even more time on
Yeah.
marketing, and I've hired people to help me do marketing. And so that's kind of like a big
I
focus
think
of
that's a
mine.
great idea because if we're right about what's coming, um, you're gonna be busier than you've been in quite a while, right? Because again, a lot of syndicators were out there doing deals to get fees. Uh, you weren't doing deals because they didn't make sense. I mean, you and
Yeah.
I sold stuff pre-run up and kind of been waiting. It's not that we've been working, but there's just nothing that made sense.
Yeah.
And I think our time is coming.
I mean, the hotel stuff I discovered, right? So that is,
Yep.
those deals are
That
making
was
sense,
fun. Yeah.
and they continue to make sense. So, so there's the marketing piece of it.
Mhm.
Then there is the looking for deals piece. So I'm spending at least a couple of hours a week, looking for new opportunities. And, again, like plan for this year is to start making that more proactive and start kind of really pounding on brokers a bit more to
Mhm.
just see what I can scrape up from them. Um,
Yeah.
and but there is the great thing is that because of the social media stuff that I'm doing, I'm starting to get unsolicited inbound leads, right?
Yeah,
And
deal flow.
nothing
Yeah.
deal
Yeah.
flow, yeah, nothing that, I mean, a couple things that we've looked at seriously, but nothing that we have made an offer on.
Inked. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's okay. That
But I do have, but like one thing came to me. It's funny because these are sometimes people I think forget this, but if you're doing a lot of social media, you'll get deals from people that you know. Like people think that they're going to get deals from people that they don't know, and that happens. People do reach out to me that I don't know. But what actually happens a lot is that like someone that you already know, but you're just not top of mind to them,
right.
will reach out and say, "Oh yeah, I saw this post that you did. I've got this property," right? And so that's actually happened recently with some folks I know who have a hotel that they're thinking of selling.
Mm.
And so my business partner and I went up a couple of weeks ago to take a look at it. We stayed there, really liked it. So now we're trying to figure out if it makes sense for us
If
to
there's a deal
offer on.
there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So, and then the other thing that I'm doing is I've started a meetup here in New York City. So if you're in New York City, please get on my list so you can come and meet me on the meetup. But also, I mean, I do spend a certain amount of time going to visit my properties. So
Mhm.
I've got the the deal upstate in New York that I'm up there once a month to check out. The deal in Vermont now that I'm up there checking out the progress on that. So those are the things that kind of keep me
Okay.
busy. So I guess every day is different. I guess I am in my office most of the time, but I do get these sort of like we used to call them out of office experiences,
Mhm.
like when I get to go and like look at a property or go check out one of the properties that I'm working on. And it's funny, a couple of weeks ago, so my business partner Shiv and I so we went to upstate New York to look at this hotel deal that we were offered, and then we drove from there to Vermont. So we had like a lot of time like in the car together, which was great. But there were a few markets that I wanted to show him in upstate New York that I'm really interested in. And they were sort of like on the route. So
Right.
we were able to stop. And
Yeah.
then we started having this conversation about the fact that like, isn't this great? Like we're just like kind of touring around, like looking at these places, but this is work, right?
Yeah.
And right, like this is not, we're not playing around. I would do this, and I would do this for fun, but
Right.
but we get to call it work.
Yeah. That's
How lucky
hilarious.
are we? So,
Yeah. You know
yeah.
what? Something I wanted to ask you, you play in an entirely different world than I do. Totally different numbers, totally all of this, which is awesome. Totally different markets, right? You'll go where the numbers make sense, and I'm very kind of focused. I saw some reports from a one of my guests, Lance Lambert from Resi Club. He used to be an editor
Mm,
at Fortune, and he put out a report. This is about single family, but I wanted to ask you because it's institutional money.
mm,
apparently there are some markets like Atlanta, Georgia, where 36% of all rental housing, like single family homes, so not
Mhm.
apartments,
Yeah.
36% of all rental homes are owned by institutions. The number is 18,406 to be exact. My question for you is that a good thing for mom and pop investors or a bad thing that it is, dominated almost 40% by an institutional investor? I just don't know. Like, as a mom and pop investor, can I invest around them and come in lower? Is it a sign that there's too much inventory and maybe liquidate? I mean, what do you think about, because again, in your world, right, apartments, we're seeing the Sun Belt with lots of units coming, which is going to take rents down. Any guts on institutional investors dominating single family home markets?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I follow him on LinkedIn and see his posts as well. So I did see that stat that he posted about, especially Atlanta. I mean, it's crazy how
Crazy,
how
right?
how concentrated they are in Atlanta. Um, but yeah, I mean, I could see this kind of, maybe this comes out in the wash because I can see some definite benefits, but as well as some disadvantages for
Okay.
mom and pop investors, right? So the advantage is that, well, if you've got somebody buying up that many houses in a market, it's definitely going to drive up the value of your holdings, right? And if
Okay.
you can, and if you
Yeah.
can figure out how to piggyback on them, because clearly they're doing some analysis that probably your average mom and pop investor is not able to do. So if you
Yeah.
could,
You're basically, they're doing it on purpose.
yeah, if you're able to figure out, I don't know how you do this, but if there's some way that you could figure out where they're buying and just buy in the same areas, then that's a way of like kind of like getting the advantage of like some massive data without having to do any of the work yourself, right? You just piggyback on what they do. So that could be interesting, right? I guess the risk is, something that you just alluded to. Like if they just decide to dump their whole portfolio at the
Yeah.
same time, right? Then you could be in deep trouble. I think it's fairly unlikely that they would do that, but
Well,
you
it's
know, but
funny
you
you
never
bring
know.
that
They
up.
have they have different reasons, right? Their
Yeah.
their their calculus is very different. They may just say, hey, we
Yeah.
we're going to take the loss, or
Yeah.
we've made
Their
enough
fund, their
money,
their
or
fund is, yeah, they have time, they have locks on these funds, right? Sometimes they
yeah,
got to get out. So it's funny about Atlanta. Blackstone just bought Tricon. I may be missing the
right.
names a little bit.
Yeah, it's Tricon. Yeah,
Oh, how about that? Memory
yeah.
works. They have 8,000 units in Atlanta.
Wow.
So overnight, Blackstone's one of the largest holders of Atlanta real estate.
Yeah.
Uh, so it's pretty interesting. I
But
actually want to.
I suspect that they're buying though to hold though, right? I don't think that Blackstone is buying to like
Well, I,
flip
I don't
it
know.
or
They
turn
they
it. I
they
mean,
spun out Invitation Homes and made a gobs of money.
hmm.
Maybe maybe I don't know. I mean, who's
Right,
going to
but what I
guess?
mean is like they're not looking to like dump them
They're
all
not
on
going
the
to flip it.
market.
No, no, no,
Yeah,
no.
like maybe they're going to go in after a few
It's a
years, sell
hold.
to another institution, right? But they're
Yeah.
not going to basically dump a bunch of homes on the market and
No,
drive the
that's
price down.
there's no
Yeah,
chance. There's no
yeah,
chance an institutional buyer with thousands of units would list them one at a time. It would destroy what they
yeah,
have.
yeah,
It just wouldn't happen. But actually, I want to go back to one of the things that you have to do now is you talked about raising capital, right? You had two buddies that
yeah,
would give you $1 million.
yeah.
There's something called an accredited investor that seems to come up in the news every 4 years about changing. Why don't we talk about what it is, when it was established, and the kerfuffle going on today?
Yeah, uh so a lot of what I do is raising money, obviously, like you said. Most of the time for my own deals, occasionally for someone else's deal, there's like a very short list of people that I will raise money for, like two at this point.
Yeah, it's like one hand, two.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like well, like one almost like two fingers, right? So
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I get asked all the time, right? But I'm not getting into bed with people that I don't really trust. So um the the most of the people that I'm raising money from are what's called accredited investors. And you probably heard this term before. Maybe you know the definition, maybe you don't. But the current definition of an accredited investor is someone who earns $200,000 a year, or with their spouse, they earn $300,000 a year, or they have a net worth of $1 million, not counting their primary residence, right? And so this definition, so there's actually a very long history to this. So back in the 1930s, when, after all the craziness of the stock market boom and bust in the 20s, the SEC was created to try to bring some, what's
Law,
the word?
some rules.
Some transparency to
Yeah.
to stocks, right? And so they created the SEC, and the SEC, for I think a lot of people may not understand this, but the SEC's job is not to pass judgment on offerings, not to say this is good or bad, not to say it's all they do is say, is it being done correctly, the offering itself? And that means you have to make certain disclosures, right? And that's what the SEC. So the SEC, it's actually one of the really kind of great institutions of government, because it's imposing transparency on the market, not
Okay.
imposing any kind of like, I mean, at least in this function. But what was realized at the time is to do a public offering on Wall Street is a very, very expensive proposition. And there's lots of deals out there that just don't justify this enormous cost, or they're not big enough. You don't want to go list, a small offering on the stock exchange, right? It just doesn't make any sense. So they carved out this exception for private offerings, right? And in order to take part in a private offering, you had to be what's called an accredited investor. And so the definition of accredited investor has changed over time, but that definition I just laid out was actually set forth in 1983. So the definition for the current definition of accredited investor is actually over 40 years old, right?
Yeah.
And it's not indexed to inflation. The SEC rule is that they revisit it every 4 years and decide whether it still is. So the idea behind making that definition and making it kind of high, like a high income threshold, was just the SEC had this idea that, well, it's a private offering, it's unregulated, you don't have to make all these disclosures like you would for a public offering. We're kind of leaving this the Wild West, but in return for it being the Wild West, we're kind of going to limit the people who could take part in it to people who can afford basically to lose their money, right? So we don't want people who can't afford to lose this money investing in these deals because they're unregulated. They can go to the public markets and buy stock, right? But for these private offerings that are Wild West, we just want people who are sophisticated, and we're just going to essentially decide that someone over a certain level of income is sophisticated, and or at the very least they can afford to blow this money, right? So now in 1983, when the current definition was revised, only 1.8% of households qualified, right?
Yeah.
So it was the top 2% essentially of earners and wealthy families in the entire country that could qualify.
Right.
However, the SEC, they review this every 4 years. They didn't index it to inflation. And what's happened over 40 years is that the number of people who are eligible has increased tenfold. And actually, it went from 13% of the population to 20% of the population, or 22, depending on who you listen to, just in the last couple of years because of inflation, right? So just from 2019 until 2022, and 2022 is the last year they measure, right? So like it nearly doubled the number of people who are eligible just in that time. So what's happening now is the SEC is having their 4-year review, and even though they've had this now 9 times, they haven't changed it. The difference now is that syndication became a thing in the last few years, and because of the Jobs Act, that was passed in 2015, 2016,
16, I think.
It opened a lot more. It just opened up the availability of these investments to people who had never even heard of them before. And now we had all these kind of syndicators rush in, do bad deals, and people who are not the 1% are now, I mean, they're only the 10%, right? Or the top 20%. They're getting hurt on these deals, and it's in the news. And I think that there is going to be more pressure now on the SEC to change the definition. So, I mean, they had been going the other direction. They had been liberalizing the definition. They had been like, there are now certain categories of work that are automatically considered accredited, not as much as I'd hoped that they were going to do, but They did expand it a little bit a few years ago, but I think there's going to be some pressure on them to raise the bar
Yeah,
now
I think
after.
if I were to think about this, and you and I have talked about this, we've done the math and just how atrocious this is going to be. But there's going to be a lot of millionaires that lose a lot of money
Yeah.
because of they were LPs in syndications, and we tried to warn them. We really did pretty consistently. And the other thing we've talked about is the pain is just starting.
Yeah.
I think there's millions and millions of dollars already lost, but just not recognized. And there's nothing like mom and dad, getting hurt in mass to get a government organization to take action. So, so I know it's just a complete guess, and maybe I'll put it out there first because why not? Do you think? I guess the question would be if the original intention in '83 was roughly 2% of the population.
Yeah.
I wonder what that threshold is today.
I'll tell you what it is today.
Oh, awesome! Because I have no idea. I'll guess. Let me just
Okay.
guess. I'm gonna
Yeah.
guess it's 7 million bucks. Just a wild guess.
Okay. Not that it's fortunately not that high, but basically, um, if you the it's gone up by basically like 3 times, right? So
Hmm,
you would have to make, instead of making $200,000, you'd
okay.
have to make $600,000.
Ooh,
Instead of 300,000 as a couple, you'd have to make 900,000,
ooh,
and
wow.
net worth would go from 1 million to 3 million. So,
Hmm.
so basically, I mean, you would wipe out 90% of accredited investors if they just reindex it to, if
So,
they decide that they're going to go whole hog and
uh,
just say this is what it should be now based on inflation. Now, I mean, however, like, so I am obviously a bit concerned about this because I don't
well, yeah.
want
Let's
nine.
let me play with that a little bit, right? So
Yeah,
again, one of the things you talked about in your new career is raising money.
yeah,
We've also highlighted that these large losses that are coming is already going to pull people back, like
yeah,
don't touch a hot stove twice. But now you get this government agency coming in and moving the bar 300%. That's going to be some tough sledding. And then what that means to me is, frankly, what that means to me is deal flow is going to slow down and prices are going to come in. That's what that really means to me.
yeah. I mean, I think if it does happen a lot, I mean, a lot will happen. So people like me will be really negatively impacted by this, obviously, because 90% of my investors will no longer be eligible. Right now, there is an exception, which is the sophisticated investor exception, but there's a lot more. So where people don't have to make that threshold of money if you can demonstrate that they're sophisticated in investing,
Right.
and which is a loosey goosey thing,
Mhm.
but it also increases your kind of regulatory burden, which is why a lot of people don't. They just focus on accredited investors because
Right.
it's much easier, right?
Yeah.
Now, so it doesn't mean like the business is going to go away, but it does mean that it's going to change quite a bit if that happens. And you're right. I think a lot of people won't qualify. A lot of people, um, like for instance, right now, an investor just has to like look at the deal and decide they like it. And if they're like, okay, I know Jonathan from one rental at a time, I like what he has to say, I trust him, and I like the deal, so I'm in. They don't ever have to like establish a relationship with me. And
Mhm.
most people don't do it because it just involves effort, they're busy, whatever. But they would have to, going forward, if the SEC does change that, they would really have to do that. The other
Right.
thing is too, there's a limit on the number of non-accredited investors you can have in your deal. So you can have unlimited numbers of accredited investors in your deal, but you can only have 35 non-accredited investors in your deal.
Wow.
So that would kind of reduce the amount of money that you could potentially raise. I think anyway, the net of this would be that there would be a lot of deals that have accredited investors that are selling, and then a lot of not as much demand because so much of what we saw in the last cycle was driven by
Yeah.
these syndications, and
Oh, no doubt.
it'll take a big hit out of syndications,
You
but
know,
it'll
you know what?
also, oh, I'm sorry,
It's
just
it's go ahead.
no, just one other point though. One thing I think though that might give the SEC pause in this is that accredited investors have also become like a huge source of funding for startups, and
True.
this would be hugely disruptive Like it would just really mean that startups would have even harder time raising money,
Mhm.
and that would have a big impact on the ability of people to start businesses. So that might stay the SEC's hand. And also, I think there's an argument to be made, which people will make, like, hey, why should these investments only be limited to the top 2%? Like that's very unfair.
Yeah.
Other
Yeah.
people are have the ability to invest and they should be able to. Why should they be frozen out? We'll see how this plays out, though.
I'm actually having a vu moment, which is kind of frightening to me.
Hmm.
One of the reasons, again, this is very single family, but I can see the dominoes going for multifamily, is if we go back to single family, one of the reasons it got so bad was all the banks were doing the same thing.
Right.
They were foreclosing on properties and not lending, right? There was a time where I was a seven-figure net worth, 800 credit score, six-figure income, plenty of discretionary income. I couldn't buy a foreclosed property at 50% off with bank money
Hmm.
because I owned too many of them.
Right.
That's why I had to end up going hard money at 12%, 3 points,
Yeah.
and I had to pay a lot less. So what am I trying to say is my deja vu moment? If the SEC comes in with a knee-jerk reaction, takes it from, shoot, 1 million to 5 million because they want to just get nutty with it, what they're going to do is just remove all of this willing and able buyers, which is just going to crush demand, which is going to just shrink the pool to only the richy rich,
Yeah.
and they're just going to buy everything cheaper. I mean, this is such a deja vu moment. It's
Yeah.
scary to me.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of what'll happen, right?
Oh,
So, yeah. So let's
uh,
hope. Let's keep our fingers crossed and hope that this doesn't happen. But I do think that at some point, I mean, listen, at some point, the SEC is going to have to do one of two things. Either they're going to have to bite the bullet and change the definitions in some way, or they're just going to have to say, you know what, we're just going to let inflation take care of this, and eventually everybody will be accredited. And
no, that's not going to
because
happen. Yeah.
because at this rate, I mean, everybody will be accredited in
Yeah.
another 50 years or so. So, um, it's
Yeah.
it it's
No, I
I don't
agree.
think
I
they're going to
agree.
have to do something because either one of those things is sort of like you know, having everybody be accredited is kind of ridiculous.
Yeah,
But
that defeats the
yeah,
purpose. Yeah.
so
Yeah. Well, let's get back to really where all this really started is you and I have been talking about this $1 trillion in defaults. And you correctly last week pointed out that, Michael, it's much bigger than that. The $1 trillion is kind of investment grade. There's this whole other pool, which may be as big or bigger. We just don't know. But there's a lot of pain coming. And again, a lot of millionaires are going to take significant haircuts, if not complete losses. More and more people are talking about it. I forget who it was, but one of the billionaires I was reading, I wish I had my notes in front of me, but basically he sees this playing out over the next 18 to 24 months.
yeah.
Does that kind of feel right to you?
Yeah, although I mean I think it could actually take longer to play out too. I mean I think it because
Oh,
just like with I mean just think about like the financial crisis. It took years to unwind all of those foreclosures, right?
yeah, it was
I mean, it
5 or
wasn't
6
like
years easy, yeah.
yeah, I mean, it probably was the case that like the big institutions stepped in and bought tapes of thousands of houses in the first couple of years.
They
But
did.
but after that was, that wasn't the end of it. Like it kept, I remember still looking at, you ever look at Realty Track?
Oh, yeah, of
Yeah.
course.
So I remember looking on Realty Track and seeing, and this is like, 2020 and seeing stuff where like lease pendants filed like 2011, right?
Yeah,
you know,
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
it
yeah,
was still there. And
yeah.
so, and people had been living mortgage free for 8 or 9 years. And
I remember.
it's I think that it'll take longer to unwind,
Well, let's
frankly.
see.
Yeah.
So it's I know longer to, so longer
Well,
than
just
18 to 24 months is what you're
yeah,
saying.
yeah,
Not
because
longer than, okay.
yeah, longer than 18, 20 to 24 months. I think
I
I
can
think
see
the
that.
big institutions will come and cherry pick all of like the really great deals in the first 18 to 24 months, but there'll be plenty of deals after that that are not investment grade, that
I think
are
you're right. That I
that are
agree with.
yeah, value add opportunities that the
Too
big
small for the
shops,
big boys, wrong
right,
market.
right,
Yeah,
whatever.
I think that's exactly right.
Yeah,
I think the class I don't know what you want. Not really class A, but the diamonds in the rough, the locations, the assets, that will all be absorbed in 18 to 24 months. But where I play, that will
Yeah.
probably play out over 4 years. I think
Yeah.
that's
I think
fair to
there'll
say.
be the opportunity will not be like a fleeting one. I think it's gonna, and I think the market is going to be, frankly, it's going to be depressed for a while. And I don't think, I don't think interest rate cuts are going to rescue that many people. I mean, if they happen at all. I mean, you saw like the economy is still on fire,
Yeah,
right?
GDP,
And
what was it, 3.2% for
yeah, something
Q4?
like that.
Crazy.
And listen, I saw somebody, I can't remember who it was. I saw somebody just today. So it was on CNBC or something. Some billionaire that we're supposed to listen to said that they see economic growth for the next 5 years averaging 2.7%.
Wow.
Yeah, that's their forecast, 2.7% between now and 2028. So if that's the case, like, do you really think that there's a case for rate cuts? I mean,
Not,
maybe at the margins, but like,
yeah. Yeah, we're
you know,
talking one or two. Yeah, exactly.
yeah, we're not going back to
We're
rates that are
not
going to
going to
stay at
zero.
values. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, and just like I said, as we've said before on other episodes, the if in just like sort of a normal average environment, well, you'd say, okay, well, we're just going to focus on growing our NOI so that, even though cap rates are going to decompress, well, it'll all sort of even out. And maybe we won't make as much money as we'd hoped, but we'll still deliver a decent return and it'll be fine in the end. The problem is that, it's not just cap rates expanding, it's expenses exploding and
Yeah.
supply exploding. So rents are falling. And this is across, of course, this is not everywhere, but this is in certain
In
markets,
plenty
right?
of places. Yeah.
In plenty of places, a lot of the darlings, over the last few years are places where this is happening. And, the other thing that this guy said, which, felt personally good to me because I've been saying the same thing for a while, is that this is not an across the board problem. This is not like a problem for
National.
all
Yeah.
US multifamily. This is in specific markets. So you have to get granular about your investing, right? You have to understand your markets. You can't just throw money into a deal anywhere and expect it to be good.
Mhm.
It has to go back to the fundamentals of people understanding how to invest. And that means getting granular about your markets, looking at supply and demand, right? Figuring out where there are supply demand imbalances that you can take advantage of. And that's how you have to invest. And that's kind of always how you had to invest until this craziness of the last few years, right?
Yeah.
So, um, but I
I,
think, yeah,
I've I've said for a while that financial engineers are going to hurt a lot of people and get hurt, but the good operators are going to come out of this stronger. And
yeah.
as guys who sold at the peak or near the peak, who didn't do deals when they were stupid, who didn't do deals just for fees, I look forward to the next 5 years. I really do.
I think there's gonna be a lot of opportunity for people who have been frozen out over the last few years. I mean, as long as, I'll say this, sometimes things don't work out the way you want, but they work out for the best. And
There you
what
go.
I'm referring to here is that I'm sure that there are people listening to this show right now who over the last 3 or 4 years have been like slaving away at some job that they don't like, and they've been wishing they could break into real estate and nothing made sense. They couldn't buy anything, and
Yeah,
they've
good
been
point.
feeling like a loser, right? They've been thinking like, I'm a failure because I'm stuck in this job I hate, and I can't be like those guys out there making money in real estate and living the life. Well, listen, for people like that who have just been like saving up their pennies for the last 4 or 5 years, you know, you guys are the ones with the cash, right?
Exactly. It's your
You
time
guys are
is
the ones
coming.
with the cash. Your time is coming, right? So 10 years from now, you may look back and say, like, well, thank goodness, like I was still slaving away at my job during the bubble, because then I
Yep,
was able to buy bargains, because I had the
exactly.
cash.
Yeah,
So
going back to how we started the show, if you
yeah.
hate your job, sometimes timing works out. Jonathan, you put out a lot of stuff in your Facebook group. What is it so people can go follow and be a part of it?
Yeah. Come to apartmentinvestorsclub.com and join the Facebook group. You can also go to my website, apartmentinvestorsclub.com, and get a free download there. And I also have a podcast, apartmentinvestorsclub.com. And also, you know, feel free to come. I post a lot on LinkedIn as well these days, maybe even more than on Facebook. Probably, I should say yes, more than on Facebook. So come follow me on LinkedIn. You know, send me a connection request. Glad to hear from you.
Awesome, Jonathan. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.